I think what is absolutely clear from the recent election is that there is a lot of concern about jobs. Are subsidies going to achieve the goal of getting us the jobs that we need? We need to decide what we need to spend money on. Do we need to spend $10 billion on incentives to the chip industry, which is going to employ very few people and is probably going to take much more in terms of subsidies to get us anywhere near the frontier? Or should we instead spend money building stronger engineering colleges, scientific labs, scientific establishments to get us the technology that would allow us a broader set of areas we could participate in?
Hello and welcome to Outlook Business Strategic Minds. I'm your host Neeraj Thakur, and today we have a very special guest. His name is Professor Raghuram Rajan. He was India's former CEA as well as RBI's governor. Currently, he is teaching finance. We would like to welcome Professor Rajan. Professor Rajan, welcome to our show. Thank you very much for joining us. And today we have called you to discuss a very hot topic in India that is being discussed, especially post-budget. The topic is employment in India.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to the show.
So, Professor Rajan, my first question is that after a very, very long time, we have discussed employment in India's budget. Now, according to you, do you think that this is in the latest budget presented by India's finance minister, was it out of political compulsion, or do you think that the center finally agrees that there is a jobs problem in India?
It's hard to go into the mind of the finance minister and understand what the intent was. I think what is absolutely clear from the recent election is that there is a lot of concern about jobs. You can see it in any data that you look at closely, including the millions applying for public sector jobs, whether they're in the railways, whether it's UPSC. So this suggests a certain amounts of angst amongst our youth. I think Santosh Mehrotra has said that we're probably underperforming on jobs on a yearly basis by a couple of million relative to our own past. And even then, we were probably producing about 2 or 3 million too few jobs for the 8 to 10 million that are coming into labor force every year. So, we don't have a strong participation rate, especially amongst women. And even then, we are unable to create jobs for the people who are coming in. That's very, very worrisome because it suggests that we're not taking full advantage of the period we have a lot of young people coming into the labor force, the so-called population dividend. We need to remedy this fast. Otherwise, we won't get the kind of growth which will propel us into Viksit Bharat status.
All right. Professor Rajan, you have been very critical of the production-linked incentive. This time, the Indian government has come up with something called employment-linked incentive for the private sector. Do you think that this is a panacea for solving India's unemployment issue?
I think there is no silver bullet. There's no magic bullet here. We have to work on a number of fronts, both in terms of the short term as well as the longer term. And I think it has to be across sectors. Now, people sort of sometimes think I'm against manufacturing. Absolutely not. I think we need all the manufacturing jobs we can get across the spectrum, low-skilled, high-skilled, medium-skilled, etc. But I do think that we, as a relatively poor country, still have a resource constraint. We need to decide what we need to spend money on to achieve our objectives. Too little money spread too thinly is going to do nothing. And so one of the things we need to see is, do we need to spend, $10 billion or 75,000 crores on incentives to the chip industry, which is going to employ very few people and is probably going to take much more in terms of subsidies to get us anywhere near the frontier? Or should we instead spend money building stronger engineering colleges, scientific labs, scientific establishments to get us the technology that would allow us a broader set of areas we could participate in, including AI, including chip design. So I think it's not about subsidies per se. It is, our subsidies going to achieve the goal of getting us the jobs that we need? If I just subsidize and tell you I'm going to subsidize your production, you're going to bring all your production to India, but you're going to import every component there is, because there is really no incentive to make it here, given the fact that you have optimized supply chains elsewhere. So you need to think about the whole process of how you bring it in, including, your tariff structure. Are you preventing people from making intermediate goods in India? Also, the quality of the workforce. You have to strengthen the quality of the workforce so they want to bring everything in. So what I've been arguing for is holistic thinking. Let us think through the process. Some of it requires small tweaks. I am glad the government has taken up these employment creation possibilities. Some of it may require incentivizing industry to, build apprenticeships so that college graduates or high school graduates can go the last mile and learn something about the specific skills that industry needs. We have to see whether the kinds of subsidies that are put there, the employment-linked incentives, are enough to create the kind of job ecosystem we want. But beyond that, there are longer-term issues. How do we get skilling and education to the levels that we need? India doesn't have one university in the top 100, and we want to go head-to-head with China in technology. We have to think about what resources that needs, and that may require diverting resources from elsewhere. We may not be able to afford this kind of subsidies the chip industry requires, but it may have to be put into better universities, better colleges.
Professor Rajan, since you're mentioning that, we may have to divert resources from a particular segment towards skilling, which sector do you think India has been wasting its resources on, or maybe we may just divert its resources from towards providing better education to our youth, or even younger kids, because the biggest problem in India has been the school education, which is in the domain of the state governments more than the center. And how do you think India can generate resources?
Well, I think we have a lot of programs underway, even at the school level. But we really need to see what works. And of course, in this day and age, the impetus to use technology more is there, but it has to be blended with our teachers, the actual workforce there is, because you can't just throw technology at a child and say, learn. It's not going to happen. It has to be that blended mix between teachers participating in themselves, being skilled in the technology, and allowing children to expand. And what is interesting is when you talk to organizations like Pratham, they say there is no actual digital bar for the poorest kids learning if they have access to the resources. They have experiments during the pandemic where they give really poor children access to resources like iPads and laptops. And those kids were, very quickly doing fantastic things, which their teachers could not anticipate. So I think our young have a lot of potential, but we need to again see what works and push resources there. Now, you said, where do I see sort of excess resources? Well, I think that, as a poor country, very few places where we have excess resources. What I've been sort of railing against is this, chip incentives to chip manufacturing, which I think is a complete white elephant for us at this stage of our development. That far better for us to invest the huge amounts of money. I mean, the $10 billion we're talking about is the tip of the iceberg to really, and we're not even thinking about getting to the frontier on chip manufacturing. To get there, with China is spending enormous resources, hundreds of billions of dollars in doing that. But China also has spent a lot of money on improving the quality of its universities and so on, and is 5 times richer than India as far as GDP goes. So they have the resources. We don't just now. For us to get into the chip subsidy game is a ruinous process and is primarily driven by the fact that it seems like an attractive industry to get into. I think for the moment, we should be focusing on where we really need to put our resources. One example is, we've had a lot of kids falling behind during the pandemic. And actually, the states where they fall behind the most are the poorest states, the Jharkhands and the Bihars in India. So yes, education, a lot of it is the state's responsibility. But the center also has a responsibility to, top up in states that are unable to do a good job here and to bring best practices to those states. Now, if we don't elevate the quality of primary and secondary education in those states, we're going to see strong divergence going forward as new technologies like AI make it much, much more important for Indian workers to have strong skills. If the kid hasn't learned basic skills in school, what college is the child going to be capable of doing? And of course, what job is a child going to be capable of getting? One last
Exactly,
point
Professor
here.
Rajan, since we are discussing, the lack of good quality school education. School education is in the domain of state governments. Do you think that there is a structural problem in India's constitution and the way this has been decided? Because there is nothing that the center can do much about it.
That's not quite correct. I mean, the center has had programs, Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, for example, which have worked with the states in helping the states improve the quality of education. So it is something that they can work together on. And I think at this time in India's sort of development, education is probably the most important sort of aspect for governments to focus on. And what is particularly worrisome at this point is if you look at Indian spending, center plus state on education, especially look at the center budget, it hasn't changed. It's as a fraction of GDP, it's where it was. I mean, yes, you put in Falana stuff into it and add it up, it looks a little better. But you look at the direct sort of spending on education, it hasn't moved. That, to my mind, is a worrisome factor, which is saying that we're not paying enough attention to education. I mean, look at what China did to improve the quality of its colleges, for example. It focused on bringing back professors from the rest of the world into Chinese universities to create sort of strong research programs. Those universities then created PhDs who then fed the other sort of parts of the Chinese ecosystem. And it also focused on rewarding more research in those universities to get it, up. And, what have we been doing on this? To my mind, our attempts to attract back some of the diaspora in science, in technology, in engineering have been very, very weak. We almost say they should feel privileged to come back. That's a non-program. That's not going to work. You have to attract them back without making the people who professors who stayed in India and who are very good from feeling like they're second-class citizens. That requires management, but it can be done. It's something that China has done, and that shows in the quality of its universities. Tsinghua, for example, is one of the top universities in the world, on par in some measures with MIT and Caltech. So I think we need to do far more, and it's across the spectrum. In our conversation, we've been ranging from primary schools, even I would go below that, Anganwadis, making sure that childcare, child nutrition, our malnutrition rate is horrendous in some states. In some states, it's on par with the first world. Why such a difference within the country? We need to focus on that. So my sense is that we're all for development, but we need to get our priorities right. And our priorities right now are, I like the fact that we are actually talking about unemployment. Earlier, we dismissed it and said unemployment is not an issue. I think fortunately we're starting to talk about we need far better measurement. Why are we having this empty debate? Is unemployment high or low? Just look outside and you will see that unemployment is a huge issue. That's what the election also told us. But let's get better data. Why don't we collect better data on unemployment? Why are we still based on the annual PLFS, periodic labor force survey for our data on unemployment? We need much better data, and it shouldn't just be the private sector, CMI, providing it. The labor ministry should provide it regularly on a monthly basis. It's high time it does that.
All right. Professor, since you were mentioning that we need to improve our education, especially on the STEM side, there's a culture in India of collecting diplomas and degrees, especially on the humanities side. Most people, they are just wanting to just get degrees, maybe an open education degree, MA. Some people are getting into MPhil and PhDs as well, but mostly on the side of humanities. Do you think it's a cultural issue in India, or it's just that because we do not focus so much on STEM education at the school level because the quality of education is not good, so people are just forced to get humanities degrees, which may never land them in good jobs other than few UPSC jobs, which are very limited?
I think it's a complicated issue with many causes. One of the causes you mentioned is that yes, education is a status issue in India also. Having a degree is important. That's good, actually. It's not a bad thing that people want to get better educated. But then you mentioned the second aspect, coming up through a school which hasn't really taught them that much. The entrance exams for the various technical colleges or getting into a STEM program, science, technology, engineering, math, that becomes more difficult because they don't have the basic math, the basic chemistry, physics to get in. And so it seems as if what they should do is go to an arts college. Properly taught, even that is quite difficult. But we have a whole explosion in degree granting colleges, and you can always find the low quality degree granting college which will give you that degree, and in some cases on payment of a pretty hefty college fee. I think we do need to examine the quality of our college education. That's absolutely important. I think the national education policy document is good on this, but we need to implement, which we haven't done. We need to figure out how to tell people what the quality of the degree they will get will be and what it will do to their employability. Spending lakhs on an engineering degree which doesn't get you a job because you learned nothing in that engineering college, is a really deep blow, both for the aspirant as well as their families who save and spend on their child to get them into a good job. We do need to give people applying to colleges a sense of what the outcomes will be. And that may well be something the government has to insist more on. Can we track graduates from your college on their employment 2 years, 3 years from when they've graduated? So it's not just what happens when they graduate, which can be manipulated, but what happens a few years down the line? Are they holding good jobs? What is the average salary in those jobs? Those kinds of metrics, I think, need to be tracked, need to be shared with the broader public. But also we need much better sort of examination of the quality of education. The accreditation process has to be much more rigorous. It is interesting that the few high quality institutions I've been associated with have a very, very rigorous accreditation process. You see the authorities coming regularly to try and evaluate. But the low quality institutions, the capitation fee colleges, don't seem to have anybody checking on them. That is a travesty in the system. We need far better and more regular accreditation, as well as constant reevaluation of the quality of education there. That's something the government can do. and should focus on that as one of its prime objectives, as the national education policy suggests.
Professor Rajan, my next question is on what creates more jobs. If you just look at the current government, their focus has been on incentivizing larger corporates to look for growth, and in return, when they invest money back in the economy, that will create more jobs. However, the opposition party, Congress, has actually mentioned MSMEs in its election manifesto, and they have said that they will prioritize reviving MSMEs, which have not been doing well since the launch of GST and then post demonetization. Now, as a professor of economics, Professor Rajan, I would like to understand from you, what's your take on this thing? Bigger companies versus MSMEs. Of course, if we focus on MSMEs, there is an issue with quality of jobs and whether Indian youth, the aspiration youth, want to do those kind of jobs. But if we focus on bigger corporates, of course, they are getting into AI and they are using more and more of robotics, which is going to generate maybe higher growth for India, but lesser number of jobs.
Yeah, the bane of India has been our bureaucracy choosing, I will favor this or I will favor that. They almost invariably make the wrong choice. And that has been our problem right through. And so I would not have a clever bureaucrat in Delhi deciding, I will figure these companies as national champions. I will favor those companies because they're bigger in size. I think what we need to do is create the environment where anybody can flourish. And those that are not flourishing, we figure out why they're not flourishing and help them out to the extent possible without undue favors, right? That's what we need to do, create a better business environment. So one of the problems I have with the PLI scheme is many of the PLI schemes are oriented at really big entities who often have access to finance themselves. They don't need that kind of support. And some of this, offering subsidies to Apple is like, pouring money into an entity that absolutely doesn't need it, but is in a very good place to lobby for it. So we get into the system where the bureaucrats respond to lobbying by the big entities and the small entities get left out, right? So I would rather that we create a much more level playing field. Now, you mentioned large companies. One of the problems, if you look at Indian industry and manufacturing, is it has steadily moved towards a more capital-intensive manufacturing. It has left behind the labor-intensive manufacturing segments. One of the worrisome aspects is if you look at the index of industrial production, it's doing very badly for the labor-intensive sectors of the index. I looked at this carefully a while back, but till about between 2015 and 2023, the most labor-intensive segments, 11 out of the 23 in the index, had actually shrunk. So this is suggesting that we have a problem because we are a labor-intensive country. But instead, we are going capital-intensive, the steel, auto, big auto manufacturing and so on, rather than leather or textiles. We need to encourage those. Now, again, I would not pick winners. I would ask, what is the constraint in these areas? Is it finance? Is it the quality of technology? Can we sort of find ways to bring in technology from elsewhere to share? Can we encourage joint partnerships? Is it access to markets? Do they have easy access to export markets? Can we work on that? And can we work on the quality of the labor force? Can we improve the quality of training? Maybe have the ITIs sort of work with the local manufacturers to provide the skills that they need, as well as have. So I think there are myriad programs like this. We need to see what works and expand them and fund them adequately. What sometimes happens is we have a program for every need, but very, very poor funding. I've seen programs with 10 crores, 20 crores. That's not going to do anything in a country which is the size of India. We need to figure out where and what and expand that quite a bit. So bottom line is I would not favor a sector. I would the MSMEs are weaker because they don't have as much access to finance or technology or even good workers. And I would sort of level the playing field by giving them some help when needed. But I would not say only MSMEs should be allowed, because there's some places where the large firms can be far more productive. One of the big concerns is we lost out on toys, for example, because it required firms of a certain size to make toys, and China allowed that while we didn't. So we should be open to large firms, but let us not subsidize one segment or the other. And I'm most averse to this new principle of creating national champions. We have no idea who should be the national champion. And why are we favoring politically well-connected firms to become those national champions at the expense of all the others who could be, great manufacturers on their own? So I would just throw the national champion idea out of the window.
One more aspect I want to discuss with you, Professor, is we have been waiting for the eastern side of India to get some industries for the last now 75, 77 years. It has not happened. So East remains supplier of labor, whereas the West and the South remain, they have become industrial hubs. And this also increases the cost of production to an extent, because people who are living in Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, whenever they travel to South and West, their cost of living increases. They would not want to work in those conditions at a particular segment. Don't you think that there should be or should have been incentives for Indian corporates to set up their shops in the eastern states where their labor is available more easily, and maybe it can also impact the issue of poverty, because anyone who's traveling and leaving their city, hometown, and traveling to another city, it takes one or two generations for them to find their feet.
I think the ideal would be even growth through the country. But I do think that, some states have created a better business environment, the South and the West, as well as have the kind of supports, good power, good transportation, which allows manufacturing or production more generally to flourish. And as a result, some of the eastern states have become more raw material producers rather than final goods producers. Now, you can subsidize for a little while, but what happens when you subsidize is that you get what happens with the PLI scheme in some places. People bring final production to that particular state, but a lot of the inputs are imported, and then you get the subsidy because you created that assembly line in that particular place.
But Professor, once a factory gets established, for example, in a particular state, for the whole IT industry was set up by giving tax incentives to companies setting up their shops in the state of Karnataka. It has happened in hilly states as well. Somehow, this kind of scheme has never been there on the eastern side. For example, I can just give an example. For example, if the government announces 1 or 2% corporate tax break for Reliance Industries or on maybe top level guys, just to set up their larger industrial, or maybe the automobile sector, don't you think that it will force those companies to set up their shops there? Of course, you need infrastructure and so many other things, definitely.
Not the level of subsidies that the government can offer. And we've had this before. I'm old enough to remember when we had these massive subsidies for setting up factories in underdeveloped areas. But even that was not enough. And what went to those underdeveloped areas, partly because the big issue was workers were not trained enough necessarily, roads were not good enough, et cetera, that the minimum manufacturing was taken there. And a lot of stuff was imported from the rest of India into those places of final finishing. In other words, what I'm saying is we need a holistic answer rather than saying subsidies will bring it there, which means that I agree with you entirely that we need more equitable development, but we need to bring better sort of education, better roads, better power to those states, so that there is an incentive to come there. Now, cheap power, for example, could do a lot. So, to the extent that there are sources of cheap power in those states, maybe that could be the attractor for power-intensive, factories like aluminum factories and so on. But I think what we need to do is figure out what might be the places where a particular state may excel, and then work on improving the underlying infrastructure and capabilities in that state. And this is where central support may be necessary because, as you say, there's a sort of chicken and egg problem. Some of these states are poor, so they cannot fund the kind of infrastructure and business environment that would bring industry. But the center has to help in that process. But look, I think subsidies seem to be the easy answer. But subsidies, attract at the superficial level. And if you really want change, you need to attack the underlying issues.
Professor Rajan, if I were to ask you, suggest 5 key areas where if Indian government goes wrong for the next 20 years, that we may just miss the bus of becoming a developed nation. What would those 5 areas be?
Well, I'd start with what we've already been talking about, education. A lot of people say education will take a long time to get right, etc. Yeah, but you need to do it if you want to become a developed country. You cannot have a developed country with the levels of education as well as the levels of malnutrition that we have. So point number one, let's start. It may take 5-6 years, but we're talking about 2047. That's a long way off. It's time we get our education under control. The fact that our budget hasn't increased on education, to me, is a reflection of inadequate prioritizing. Second, we do need jobs in the short term, and that comes from a couple of things. One is, where we can, we should create employment. Either if it's at the margin incentivizing industry in the way that the government has with these schemes. We have to see if it's adequate. I don't know. But also, Anganwadis need more workers. That will be very helpful in creating a better environment for our children. Can we employ maybe half an additional worker, but make it a mother from the village so that the mother also gets into employment and learns how to, hold a job, and maybe then becomes a teacher in the village or and so on. We have a lot of high school graduates who are not sort of in the workforce. Can we start ways of getting them in? Some of it may be government jobs, but some of it may be other jobs. If we are thoughtful, we can think of expanding healthcare. That can be done with quote unquote barefoot doctors. We have examples of barefoot doctors across India, people who worked in dispensaries and are now offering doctor services. Can we improve their quality so that at least the first year of support to people who have medical issues can be dealt with? And then if they don't understand, they don't know, they push it up to a more qualified doctor. So lots of jobs can be created for the needs of our population. Let's focus on that. That's one. Second, there's a last mile up training that can make people employable. Example, we have a lot of engineering graduates, but they really don't know how to do an engineering job. 6 months to a year of training in the right job may make them, they broadly know the principles which they learned, but may make them very employable. So one example is there's a chip design firm which set up and hired these kids that it then trained up for a year, and then started providing services for Qualcomm, Intel, etc. in chip design. So if something as intricate as chip design can be done through intensive training, and of course, our Infosys, Wipros, and TCSs have been training up people in coding, but that can now shift to AI, they can shift to machine learning. Our young people are very, very intent on learning. So upgrading that last mile. I was talking to somebody who actually trains plumbers. If we could train high quality plumbers, I mean, you are in an urban area, you know how hard it is to find a good plumber to actually work in your house. So there are myriad jobs if the training is adequate. So can we train up? And we need to invest in that in a much more serious way, as well as see what works and what doesn't. So those are two short-term things that I would think of. I think in terms of longer-term jobs, agri-industry is going to be a big source. Our agriculture is strong. Can we increase value added? Of course, we need to increase productivity in agriculture itself, but can we increase value added there? Flowers, vegetables, but processed vegetables, pickles rather than mangoes. Can we do a lot more of that, which can create jobs, especially if the processing is labor intensive? Cut flowers. Cutting those flowers is a labor intensive process. But then we can export to Europe, we can export to the Middle East, we can export to East Asia. So getting that done. So, that would create jobs. Construction would create jobs. And of course, services for our human capital, healthcare, education, sanitation in the big cities, all those would be job creation. These are 5 areas that education, jobs in the short term, and jobs in the longer term by strengthening some of the sectors which are job intensive. I think that would create some employability and some growth. Longer run, technology, intellectual property, we have to do far more. Our pharmaceutical firms are still into generics for the most part. Can we get them into innovation? But that requires sort of academia, industry collaboration of the kind we have in the US. But it also requires upgrading our academic institutions. I am working with a university which has fantastic students, but the problem is it till recently didn't have enough money to buy a spectrometer. And a spectrometer is the basis for a lot of scientific research. So now we have that money, but that should be true of every scientific establishment in the country, that it shouldn't lack for basic technological resources, which will allow professors and students to jointly do research. And that should be our goal, to scale the technological heights. India is capable of everything, but it needs the opportunity.
One more question, Professor Rajan. All the questions that I asked you and all the answers that you gave were more or less, they were targeted at the formal employment generation and formal kind of jobs. But there is one more big issue that the world is facing. Now we have Gen Zs, who do not want to work in the traditional jobs. They want to be self-employed. They want to be part of the gig economy. Some like gig economy could be at a lower level, but a lot of engineers are also part of the gig economy, GitHub and all. Do you think that India is preparing itself, or is there a thought process in India where they are looking at creating jobs for Gen Zs, the kind of job Gen Zs require? Because they have a different mindset. They're completely different from millennials or maybe your generation.
Well, you just said creating jobs, and at the same time you said they want to create jobs. I think you're absolutely right. We should let them create jobs by creating an environment which is tolerant of that. I think one aspect of that tolerance is allowing them to fail, because a lot of small ventures failed. And I think that that mindset is coming into India, that people are much more willing to take the chance, this generation, of avoiding Hindustan Lever or State Bank of India and going into self-employment, seeing how it works, knowing that eventually if they need it, they will go to the formal sector. I think that's a good development. I think that's to be encouraged, which means let's not strangle them with bureaucratic sort of requirements, rules and regulations, inspectors, the Inspector Raj, etc. It's the same story for the rest of the small and medium enterprises. But if we create an enabling business environment, we have the young people who will actually take advantage. I mean, when you walk across these cities, you see so many new establishments and new kinds of ventures which weren't there before. I mean, just even if you look at the internet, so many influencers, so many new podcasts, so many new podcasters, so many people giving news in a different way, which earlier we used to get from Doordarshan. So I think this is all good. I think to encourage the ferment, we have to allow our young people to question, to challenge. And that means much less of an authoritarian government, whether at the state or the central level, much less of an attempt to censor. Yes, censor hate speech, but do it evenly, and don't just quell anybody who questions the government. I think that is something we should focus on, and many of these rebels will become the Googles and the Facebooks of their generation if given the chance. So by all means, I think we should do everything we can to encourage them.
All right, so we will end this episode of Strategic Minds with Professor Raghuram Rajan on this note of discussing Gen Zs. Thank you very much, Professor Rajan, for coming and talking to us.